Welcome to the Squeaky Wheel Farm. Hi, I'm Christine. Well, I was down to my pantry in the basement today and I noticed that I only have 2 jars of beef stew left. So that's my project for today. I'm going to get some beef stew canned up so that we have it for those quick and easy meals on cold winter days. Come along with me and let me show you how I make beef stew. Well, I've already washed my jars in hot soapy water and they're draining over there on the dish pad. I've also chopped up 2 cups of celery. These will get put into our jars. I've got some onion. This summer when I grew onions, they were really strong. So I just ran them through the food processor really quick and froze them in baggies. And you can even smell the onion through the baggie. So it was not something that I wanted to put in my dehydrator. I do like to have onion powder and dried onion bits on hand, but that is not something that I would have put in my dehydrator. I was afraid that it would just give a smell that I wouldn't be able to get out. We got celery, we got onions. The other ingredients are potatoes and carrots, and then of course the beef. So it'll take me just a couple minutes to get this all ready and I'll show you how I put it together. I always encourage everyone to use what you have on hand because this is really a forgiving recipe. You can modify it any ways that you need to, according to the likes of you and your family. But potatoes are one thing I want to stress to use. Good potatoes, if you have a choice, use a russet or some other white kind of potato that stores better. Now, mainly because the red potatoes have so much starch in them, they're very creamy and they make great mashed potatoes and fried potatoes. But they will make your beef stew kind of cloudy. So these are actually ones that I grew in my garden this year. There's some russet here and there's some Kennebec, which is also an all-purpose potato. It's kind of waxy, but it holds up well in the jar. It doesn't disintegrate. Now, if you wanted to modify this recipe and maybe just make vegetable soup, that's really easy to do. That's just a matter of adding some tomatoes, or I've got tomato powder that's dehydrated. I could do that. And what other vegetables you like to add. Notice this water is a little bit dirty, and that's because when you're storing potatoes, you don't wash them first. So that is why I'm giving these a good rinse and scrub before I take the skins off. This one's a little misshapen, and that's probably because my ground wasn't as soft and flexible as it could have been. So when you have ground that's really, really loamy and gives for the potato, they grow really nice and evenly. Our ground has some sand and some clay in it, and I've been building it up with compost over the years, but you know, it is what it is. I don't have a lot of loam, which is the powdery stuff that makes it nice and light and fluffy. So I get what I get. But these aren't bad potatoes. This is a pretty good sized potato. I wanted to mention I got a Loamy for Christmas. It's a countertop composter. And it's not just food, it'll compost cardboard and stuff. It's not something that I would have ever bought for myself, but man, have I used the heck out of it this winter. You know, especially for stuff that I don't give to my chickens. Such as I don't give them potato scraps. I don't give them eggshells. I know that you can give them eggshells, but we have some chickens that have opted to start eating their eggs, and I don't want to encourage that, so we give them oyster shells instead to make their egg shells a little thicker. This one's got a few eyes on it, no big deal, just knock them off and peel away. Beef stew is kind of a staple in our household. We call this mulligan stew not because it's a do-over or a bad thing. I know there's a lot of sports that call a mulligan it's a chance to do over because it didn't work out. That's not what this is. My grandpa's name was the Mulligan, and my mom always called this mulligan stew. That's why it's mulligan stew in our family. So I'm not saying that this stew is named after him, although it might have been. I don't know. My mom always called it mulligan stew. I'm gonna get this cleaned up so that I can start on the carrots. Now these carrots are store-bought. I have yet to master the art of growing good carrots in my garden. And a lot of times in a meal, if something calls for carrots, I will use squash or pumpkin or something else instead. Now, I know if you leave carrots in the ground until it cools, when the weather temperatures cool off, then they'll be a lot sweeter. But this hasn't worked out for me yet. I will figure it out eventually. These carrots are store-bought, and they're not necessarily the prettiest carrots in the store, but I prefer to have ugly organic produce than something that's beautiful but may not necessarily be the best for you. These will do fine in the stew, make it nice and sweet and flavorful. Now in the summertime, when I am gardening and I've got vegetables coming off my garden, I do try to throw vegetables fresh from the garden into my soups and stews. So if I've got peas or if I've got corn, those will often find their way into the jars. I want to point out, if you've got homegrown vegetables, when you're canning, you should always peel your vegetables because you want the least amount of bacteria and things into your canning process. But if I was making a soup, I wouldn't always peel my carrots. Sometimes I just give them a good scrub and chop them up and throw them in the pot. And that's because most of the vitamins and minerals are in the peels. But since we're canning this, they are getting peeled. So this whole process of making beef stew is really not that long. The longest part is actually cooking it. And I'll be doing other things while the pot is actually doing its thing. Okay, I'm gonna clean this up and then we'll get chopping and putting it together. I prefer my vegetables to be bite-sized pieces or spoon-sized pieces. Just makes it an easy meal to eat. So a lot of times when we're having soups or stews out of the stuff that I've canned, it's because we've had a busy day doing something with the cows or the animals, or building something, or fixing something, and we're tired by then. Usually it's just a matter of warming it up. Now I will tell you, the way that we're doing this does require a little effort when you're warming it up. And that is because I don't put any starch in there, so it's not a thick broth like you would have in a stew. But that's okay, because you're gonna pour off the liquid into a pot or a pan, add about a tablespoon of cornstarch, and you're off and running. That's all it takes. You just gotta put about a tablespoon of cornstarch in there and use a whisk and let it dissolve. Put it over low heat for, just a few minutes while you're watching it and stirring it the whole time. And once it starts to thicken up, then you add your other stuff from the jar, and voila, you've got a good hearty meal that's ready in 10 to 15 minutes with very little effort. That's the main thing, very little effort. Sometimes I'll make some biscuits to go with it or put some dumplings on top. But it goes with so many things. You can add noodles if you're trying to stretch it a little bit. You can pour over rice. There's so many things you can do with it. You put it inside meat pies and made like a, like a pot pie, like a beef pot pie. It's quite good too. So very versatile and something that's really nice to have ready in your pantry. Now the potatoes I'm probably going to cut just a little bit larger, because potatoes, when they cook fast, that's going to be the first thing that's done in the jar, and I don't want them to dissolve. I want them to stay nice and firm. Part of that is the type of potato you're using, and part of it is, how they're cooked. So, and they will help to thicken up the gravy in here a little bit. Okay, those are fairly uniform now. All right. So what I'm doing next is just trying to make sure that each jar gets roughly the same amount. So I'll go through one just assembly line, kind of make sure that everybody gets some carrots. And if there's any left over, then I'll go back through again. It's not an exact science. So this is a 1/2 cup measuring cup. This one's 1/4 of a cup. I've got 2 cups here of celery, so it'll be just a little bit more than 1/4 of a cup apiece. Probably looking at about a cup. Roughly. Saving the onions for last because once I open that baggie, they're going to be really strong. They've got good flavor, especially for cooking, but they're very intense. What I've got here is just some beef bouillon. You don't have to add it. It will make beef flavor just from having the meat with hopefully some of the fat that's on the meat. If you know, choosing a cut that has a little bit more fat. But I like to make this as close to like beef stew, canned beef stew that you buy in the store, so that when I do open it up, all I've got to do is put that juice in the pan, thicken it up with some starch, and go from there. All right, here we go. All right, so far we've got a cup of beef, roughly a 1/2 cup of carrots, roughly a 1.25 cups, I would say, of potatoes, and a large heaping teaspoon to somewhere between that and 1/4 cup of onions. So the last thing I'm gonna do, this is called the cold pack method, but I am gonna boil some water to put in here and fill it up about halfway. You don't have to fill it all the way to the top. The vegetables and the meat is going to give off some juice, but I like to have everything covered in my jars. And it's really important to me that I have a lot of juice in there so that when I'm making, thickening it up, it'll be enough volume to make a gravy to go over these vegetables. Okay, I've got a small bowl here. I'm just going to pour a little bit of vinegar into the bowl so that I can wipe the rims of these jars. Vinegar does come in different strengths. This is 5% and it's distilled vinegar. You want to make sure that you have at least 5%. Now I do make a lot of vinegar at home with my apple scraps. I make apple cider vinegar, but it's not something that I would use in any kind of canning situation because I want to make sure that it's strong enough to kill any bacteria, which is another reason why we're doing this. And all I'm doing is just wiping the edge of the jars. I'm still going to put some boiling water in these, but I don't think it's going to matter that I'm skipping a step because I'm not putting any fats or any salts or anything else in these jars other than water, and then they're done. So it's as simple as that. All right, some tips. Do not add any flour or starch to your jars. That's not a safe way to can. And unless you have something like clear gel, which is made for canning. I have some, but it's kind of expensive, and I save that for when I'm making apple pie filling, stuff like that, because that's kind of a treat. And this is so simple the way I do it, you know, just adding a tablespoon of starch to the juice, that it's not worth the extra expense. Another thing I've found is if you clean out as you go, it makes it not such a big job. I hear my water's starting to boil, so we're gonna hurry with these last couple of dishes. But we're almost done anyway. My daughter-in-law got me some of these. The cutting boards, they're just mats, but they're so handy. As I've gone through several of the wooden ones. And it's just nice to have these. One, they don't split and crack. And I've even set a wood one on the stove when I started the fire one time. So right now I'm just filling these jars up to the shoulder with this water. And then I'll show you how I debubble them. It's roughly taking about 3 ladles a piece. If you're canning meat, you don't necessarily have to add extra liquid, but I want the extra liquid because that's what I'm going to use to thicken and make the gravy when I dump it out of the jars. All right. This is called a debubbler. You can use this end to poke down there and make sure that you get all the bubbles out of the jars. You just move things around like so. Now my preferred method is to have everything under liquid because it's not going to go bad if you have vegetables sticking out or even meat sticking out above the liquid. However, they might get an off color to them, which is not very palatable. I want my meals to look as good as they can because I have put a little effort into this. So my goal here is not to mix it up. I am kind of poking those onions down because they tend to float and I don't want them on top as much. All right. Okay, so that should about do it. I want to show you this tool and how it works. If it's resting on the edge of the jar here, and this is touching the water or the liquid or whatever food you're processing, that's 1 inch of headspace. Again, I've already wiped all the jars off. Doesn't hurt to do it again. None of them are chipped or cracked. Set my lids on there. And this just keeps you from having to get your fingers into that hot water. And then you're going to screw your lids on, just finger tight. Undo that and do it again because it shouldn't have made that ping. Make sure that you don't cross thread these, that you get them on the threads and that they're seated appropriately. So that's important. And basically you've got the pot itself. You have this divider that keeps the jars off the bottom. These are weights, 5 pounds, one ring is 10, and the third one is 15 pounds of pressure, which is what we're going to use for 90 minutes because we're using meat, and meat needs to be cooked appropriately. And we're just adding water. It's roughly 2 quarts. There is a indentation on my pan that tells me that the water has to be at least that depth to be able to cook. I'm going to turn the heat on so that water can heat up to roughly the same as these jars, which is not much because these are just a little slightly warmer than room temperature right now because the vegetables were raw, the meat was raw, and everything else was cold. So even though I used warm water on there, it's not going to cause a problem. I did want to point out to you that you can put a little bit of vinegar into your pan. It helps with the calcium deposits on your pan and on your jars. One of these jars was really coated with calcium. But the thing is, it does eat away at your rings, and you end up having rusty rings. The pressure canner that I'm using is a 16-quart pressure canner. It's a Presto. I've had it for many, many years, but I've kept the box all these years. So glad that I did. It says right on the top that it holds 7 quarts, which is what we have. So I automatically know how many I can make and how many I can fit in there. As far as the lid goes, you want to make sure that this gasket is in good shape, but it's still got some rubbery flex to it. And then there's a vent thing here, and it unscrews sometimes, so I always double check that. And I always double check this piece on the top, because some of these things can work themselves loose, and you don't want that to happen when you're dealing with really hot food. All right, we're ready to go inside the canner. Always try to keep the temperature of your jars the same temperature of the liquid that you're putting it in. This is really close to the same, if not exactly the same. Seven jars in the canner. The water line did rise up. Some people swear that they always brown their meat or their beef or their chicken or whatever they're using in their stew before they put it in the jars, and they think that it makes it taste better. I haven't found that it changes the flavor at all. And as far as the appearance, it's the way that we're used to having our beef. I make a lot of arm roast in a crock pot, and it looks the same. Another thing I wanted to mention is I use the ball lids. There's been shortages in the past, so you had to use whatever you could get, but I did notice that I did have a lot of fails with some of the generic lids. Some of them got a little crinkle or didn't seal properly, and with the ball lids, I rarely ever have a seal that fails, so hopefully that holds true. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention. You didn't see me put any spices in that other than some beef bouillon. Now technically that is a spice. There's salt and there's a few other ingredients in there. But as far as the spices that I grow in my garden and that I often use to cook with, the flavor seems to intensify, and it's not always just what I'm used to and what I'm expecting. So I choose to flavor anything that I make afterwards. When I'm opening up the jar, then I can add salt, pepper, or whatever I decide that it needs at that time. But if you put it in now and it gets too strong, then you basically ruin the whole batch. Okay, the steam is starting to come out the top, so now is when we're going to put the weight on. I have 15 pounds, and we're just gonna slap it right on there on the top. And in a few minutes, you'll see that pressure relief valve start to pop up. There we go. So the last thing we're waiting for is this thing here to start rocking like this. When that starts, then I will start my timer. Sometimes it takes a few minutes because the pressure has to come up. That's why they call it pressure canning. Pressure has to come up from the heat to be able to make that rock. Okay, it's starting to rock. That's what you're looking for. Just a gentle rock. It shouldn't be slamming back and forth. If it is, then you'll need to turn it down a little bit. But this is the time where I start the timer, and it's going to cook for 90 minutes. Okay, time's up. Just slide it off the burner. And it's going to sit there. It's going to sit there until it cools down. And even once all the pressure's off and it's cooled down, I'll take the jars out, but then I'm going to leave them set for 24 hours as well. So I'll come back to you when it's time to open it. Okay, at this point, everything is cooled down. And you can take the weight off the top. There shouldn't be any steam coming from it, and your pressure relief valve should have gone down. You can feel the sides of the pot and the top of the pot, and it's not hot at all. And you're going to lift it off. It's not unusual to have some water or steam on the top, so be very careful of that. And you're going to use your jar grabber and just gently pick the jars up out of the canner without banging them against each other, because you don't want to have one crack. But they look pretty good. I'm going to let these cool for 24 hours. And another important step is I am going to wash them with soap and water before I put them away in my pantry. Sometimes there's a residue on the outside of the jar, and you want to make sure that it is as nice as possible. And you don't want to encourage any pests to come into your pantry. Don't forget to label these with the contents and the date so that you can rotate your stock and make sure that first of all, that you know what you've got in those jars, because sometimes it's questionable, and that can be quite surprising if you're expecting one thing and getting something completely different. So anyway, really important to mark your jars with the date and the contents. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. Oh, and one more thing. I hope to see you again soon.